Hello, everybody. This is Josh Kubicki, and I'm a legal modernist, and you're listening to the Legal Modernist podcast. Today, I talked to Tom Lenfestey. He works and lives in North Carolina. He's a lawyer, CPA, but perhaps most important, and the reason why I'm speaking to him, is he's an entrepreneur. And better than that, he's actually helping lawyers think and act and become entrepreneurs themselves. What you're going to hear today is the reality of an emerging market where lawyers are selling their law firms. And these can be solos, they can be small, they could be mid-sized firms. And other lawyers are buying them. Now, that may not seem magical or weird, but it actually is, or it was, about 10 years ago, until Tom and others began focusing on creating a marketplace. And we're going to talk today to Tom and really walk through what that process is for the buyer and seller. And what I'm really excited about is I asked Tom about the realities of a recent law graduate being able to buy a practice and how just shifting your mindset as a third-year law student to think about not going to look for a job at a law firm, but going to look at a law firm to buy. It can happen. It does happen. So listen in, and I hope you enjoy it. If someone wants to buy a law firm, how are they coming to you and how are they starting to open that dialogue with you?
So I think, how are they coming to me? I think is, been my 10-year quest, right? Is what I mean by that is getting the word out there to attorneys of all ages, stages, and everything in between that, hey, look, did you know you can buy a law firm? I mean, really, right? But really how we've taken that has been education, right? So, it's the aspect of doing talks with bar associations, doing talks with lawyers insurance at, law schools, doing webinars, right? Everything from the ABA down to the littlest, community group possible. It's really been to say, hey, did you know this is an option, right? And so to get the word out there is really the idea, right? Plant that idea and everything else. And then as far as the searchers of how we're getting to them, for us personally, we promote, right? So we're doing, promotion of, Google ads, pay-per-click. Hey, did you ever think about buying a law firm before, right? And that idea is like, oh, maybe I've heard something about this. Our best is somebody who's already started to think about it. Maybe they heard a podcast, maybe they watched a webinar, maybe somebody was talking to them about, somebody else doing this. And they've gone because of their entrepreneurial spirit and started to do a Google search, right? Buy a law firm. Hopefully, right, we pop up or some of our opportunities do or others do. That's fine. It's part of the marketplace. But really, that's the overall goal is how do we get entrepreneurs, whether they're business owners now or not, but how do we get them to do that? Because they've already kind of started to buy into the concept of buying, right? Or of acquisition. Sometimes it's really hard when we see the ideal, buyer out there, but they're just not a buyer, right? They're just an attorney or they're just a law firm. They haven't adopted that. So the short answer is really, the hope is that entrepreneurial kind of spirit or person or attorneys out there, we've somehow been able to get the word out or they've seen this or done their own research as a concept. And then we'll really try to grab them and, continue that education, right? To see if there's opportunities that may fit what they're looking for.
So are most people, when you're giving those talks, and I can imagine it's a long game that you're in, right? I mean, you've been at this for about 10 years now, and you're definitely the leader, I would say, in just my research, or one of them with due respect to some other people, but you're definitely more prominent out there in creating this market. So I've got to ask you, like, when you say, like, did you know you can buy a law firm? Are most people like, I've never even thought of that? Or are they like, no, you can't. Like, you can't buy a law firm. Like, what's generally their reaction?
Yeah, what I'd say is 10 years ago, I had more hair, less weight, right? Everything else. But overall, 10 years ago, I think the answer when you would say that, or the response, I guess, is can you, right? Or how does that even work, right? It was more of that, or even when we talk to the sellers, the same thing. I don't think you can do that. And ethically, it's allowed. The ABA passed the rule years and years ago. But overall, it still is a question more so of can it work, or how does that work? Versus, I think now we've at least gotten to the point with what I'll call the marketplace that most attorneys that we at least talk to understand you can do it. They're just not sure how it works or that it could work for them to be successful.
Okay, so that makes sense, and that's a good segue into our little hypothetical here, which is kind of based on fact, but I'm going to change some things just because I don't want to completely share my personal life with listeners, but I'll share some personal facts. So my wife and I live here in Cincinnati, and I'm an entrepreneur, have been always in legal, but have young kids. And so I've been looking over the last, I would say, a couple of years, right before COVID, of purchasing a small business. And we've looked at everything from franchises to mom and pop shops. We've looked at, the restaurant business and industry, which is not a good place to go if you have young kids, opening putt-putt, ice cream stands. Like, we've looked at a lot, and we're really trying to determine our fit. And then somewhere, probably every 2 months, it'll occur to me that I'm a lawyer, still licensed. I don't practice. I'm a law professor. I've been in this business for 20 years. I get paid as a design agency to make practice groups more profitable, more competitive, increase market share. And while I tend to work in the mid to big law segment, those problems are scaled down into small to mid-size too. So I often go, well, why wouldn't I look at buying a law firm? So let's play with this scenario, if it's okay with you. So say that I have 250 or $500,000 money to invest. I've got enough liquidity to invest, or cash, or however you want to look at it. And I come to you and say, hey, Tom, I'm a lawyer. This is my story. I'm not sure if I want to be a practicing lawyer because I'm DC barred. So does that mean I have to buy a DC law firm, or can I buy a law firm anywhere? Question one. And question two is, do I have to be practicing, or can I be the operator or non-practicing managing partner of a law firm? And can you sort of help me find a law firm to buy? Like, how would you vet me as a buyer? Would you say, Josh, sorry, man, that doesn't fit our qualifications? Or like, guide me through how you would sort of vet me and figure out if I'm a buyer or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do my discovery, right? Consult, from that. But the first thing I would ask Josh is why, right? What is your why to acquisition? I mean, so many lawyers or law firms we run into, the why may be, growth, right? But really for you, it may be growth, but it's because of X, Y, and Z, right? Or it's ownership to deploy, these different things. And I think the why, right, that I would ask you would help craft, what type of firm we would potentially be looking for, right? Or if buying a firm is even an achievable path, right, to get you to that point. So I would say the first one is why. What is that motive? And it's so hard for me sometimes to have, those searchers, those buyers come to us and say, I want revenue or I want ownership, right? But it's really going beyond that of what are you really hoping to do once you have it, right? And my guess is, if I interpret kind of where you're coming from, the goal is, to shape it, to do better, to do more with it, over
That's
time
it.
the business, right?
Yeah, honestly, that's it. I'll play along here and give you my off the cuff. I haven't done a lot of deep thinking, and obviously I will, because this is a serious consideration. But yeah, my why is one, deploying capital, right? So deploying capital as a wealth preservation or creation mechanism. So let's just call that from an economic standpoint. Two, I am a lawyer, but I haven't practiced. And I've always been in big law side of things. So that people law, getting closer to the client, that's been probably something I miss as a licensed lawyer. I haven't had a lot of experience helping that human, whether that's a business client, but I'm working with the owners, or working with actual individuals and all that. Like that's probably part of me professionally. That's a gap that I have a desire to get closer to. And I think the third thing is, in my estimation, in the lawyers in my life, the ones I hire and the ones I've seen across the spectrum, there's just so much room for better client experience, for better employee experience working in the firm, humanizing the practice of law. There's so many lawyers stuck in practices on a grind that they don't know how to get out of. Like, unlocking that for lawyers would be a huge, huge thing to be able to do. And increasing some valuable metric, market share, profitability, or something like that. Obviously that goes to the wealth, but like off the cuff, that's sort of my why. I don't know, is that, I don't want to say good enough, like you're going to judge me, but is that common, those types of whys?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's common enough that I do think our new generation of owners, or our new generation of managers, right, that are looking for, acquisition, are hoping to do more with it than has been done by the previous owner, right? And part of my, coaching from the seller side, our current owners that, are of a certain generation that maybe haven't built their businesses like this, is still, they built a tremendous business, right? Even because they don't have like all this, the technology or the other systems or the culture that, you'd want to bring, they still have a tremendous business. I mean, a lot of people would really like to have $1 million, reoccurring revenue stream, a year, and that's what these attorneys have built. And it's just the hope of how do we match to do more? So yeah, I think to your point is that's what excites me, is this next wave of entrepreneurial attorneys and managers coming to say, law is a business, right? We can do more with it. We got to care for the clients, care for the team, focus on efficiencies, where a lot of the previous generation, it was just an extension of what they did, right? And so, you mentioned, Josh, your experience being more in mid to large law. The benefit we have in the space we typically play is, with overall either small ownership or small law, it's usually easier to implement some of those changes, right? Like it'd be a quicker, if you want to implement firm side marketing, right? That's easier to get a buy-in when you have, one owner that's departing and you're the new owner and you've got, two non-attorneys and, another associate attorney than if you have 100 attorneys, right? And talking to them about how we're going to shift the systems. And so overall, I think, yes, it's a great reason to do that. The other qualifiers, just to let you know, that I would ask you is what practice areas and what locations. Those are our two biggest qualifiers to match a seller with a buyer, right? Like the other synergies, like what type of practice, do they have this, do they have that? But practice area and location, two biggest things, right?
So on location, like me being DC barred, where can I not buy a law firm?
Florida.
That's it?
Yep.
Really?
Yep. Well, Florida's the only one I know of. There may be others. We just haven't transacted. Florida's the only one that I know of if you are going to do a real purchase. You could go in and be a partner, right, with somebody. You could structure it a little bit different. But the way the Florida rule is structured is you have to be a licensed attorney in Florida to purchase a Florida firm, right? It's a protective structure that they have. Again, we have people that do partnerships, do different structures versus, purchase. But overall, you as the, licensed attorney, most states will allow you to come in, be the owner. You can't practice law. You couldn't come, to North Carolina, say, and deliver North Carolina legal services, right? You as a DC attorney. You would have to have a North Carolina attorney on your team who's in charge of, going to court or providing that, real estate, advice and legal counsel and whatever else specific to North Carolina. So ownership is more wide open. You just have to make sure if you're buying in another state that the plan is to have a practicing attorney or a licensed attorney in that state to provide the legal advice and services.
Right. So owning doesn't open you up to like UPL violations, unauthorized practice of law or anything, just simply owning. Practicing is sort of that where you start to get in trouble. Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful. So I mentioned that my hypothetical liquidity or cash is $250,000 to $500,000, recognizing that alone most likely could buy you a law firm, but you might have to do additional financing. Is that the right range? Can you purchase a law firm with that amount of cash plus additional financing? And what does financing look like? Is this SBA backed loans? I mean, is it heavily seller financing because financing's tough to come by? Like, walk me through sort of the range of finance that a searcher would have to be thinking about or have readily available.
So first question, is that sufficient financing? Depends on the size of the practice, right? Or the nature of the practice that you're looking, to potentially acquire, right? But what I would say out of the gate is, to anybody that's considering being a buyer, it's not just about what money you can put into the deal. It's also, of course, the working capital, right? The funding aspect, which you know well, but as a reminder to anybody else, like if you go out and get a loan, they'll figure that in. Like, hey, you need money to make payroll the first 90 days and, all of those other things. Traditionally, what we see as a structure is, I'd say the traditional small law office, right? If it's an attorney and, maybe they have a couple paralegals, that attorney has essentially been, the referral hub in their community. A lot of personal network, what I would call personal value, right? They don't have as much firm value. Maybe the firm's been there for 20, 30 years, whatever else. So they've got notoriety, but they've got so much attached. Like, everybody knows them. They walk down the street. Hey, counselor. Hey, attorney. Hey, lawyer, right? They know them from Rotary. They know them from, church. That's where they get their business, right? With your 250, even if that practice is doing $1 million in revenue, right? That should be, sufficient to buy a practice like that. And the reason is, most of those practices are going to be a commitment of capital by you, the buyer, right? But the other will be either, seller financed, or what we would call, a performance-based metric earnout, which really is a percentage of the dollars that come in, after you buy the practice, right? So you buy the practice, and then the next year it does $1 million, you would pay a percentage back to the seller because the practice has maintained, right? Basically on those revenues or otherwise. But you wouldn't have to put as much cash in on a practice like that. And the reason that that structure is the way it is in the marketplace is because so much is focused on that seller and what they can personally hand off to you or to the attorneys that you're going to bring in, right, as part of that. Make sense? And so, It's that personal transition piece. From that standpoint, I'll pivot to the other practices, but, does that make sense on that type of practice?
Yeah, it does. It makes me think of, and there might be a term of art for this, or I'm making it up and will sound like an idiot, but it almost sounds like, when you're describing that, it's kind of like engineering. I don't want to say artificial because it's real, but like, it's almost artificial succession planning. It's like, for that, right? I mean, it's the lawyer, that seller doesn't have anyone to plan around, or hasn't. And so that deal, when I listen to it, it's like, okay, it's kind of elongated. It's creating a succession opportunity for the seller that they didn't previously have. And it kind of sounds like a rejiggered partnership track, right? It's elongating it instead of one big capital buy of becoming an equity partner like we traditionally. We're spreading that out over years and sort of leading into it. I don't, maybe I've oversimplified it, but that's kind of what I interpreted as listening to you.
We talk, or I talk all the time about creating continuation plans for law firms, right? So that's really our goal, is if you build something, how can we continue that going forward? So under your analogy, it's the apprenticeship model, it's the baton, kind of slow handoff, but we need our seller, right, that owner, to stick with us. Because if you're the one walking in there, Josh, and buying, like, you need to be introduced at Rotary, right? You need to, it just takes a little bit different time. Pivot to different practice areas or different practices. And what I mean by that is, we run into practices, of course, that they have, firm-driven marketing, right? They don't have to go to Rotary. They've got, SEO, they're dialed in on other things, right? Like, they've got it figured out. You don't really need that owner to transition or stay with you. And the owner kind of gets a paycheck without doing a lot of that work. And so those would be, right, like, that structure is going to be your 250 or down payment, or whatever you're going to come with, is going to be the down payment. and then you'll go and get a bank funded, portion of that purchase price. Because, right, the feeling from you is, I know where the clients come from. They come from marketing, that data is tracked, everything else. It's been set up as a true business, not an extension of the personal attorney, right? And under those, our sellers typically know that they've got a better business, they make good money. And then you as the buyer can say, yeah, I can remove them, I can step in, but I'm not worried about where the next clients are coming from, as long as branding, merger announcements, those different things done right, or we just keep it as is because it's so, systematized or driven from that side. And we see that practice a lot in our plaintiff firms, more so than our transactional or some of our off litigation, meaning personal injury, right? Some of our employment litigation. Overall, we're starting to see more of it in family law, right? From that standpoint and everything else. And then with some of these contingency plaintiff firms like personal injury, workers' comp, even SSDI, practices, they have an asset that can transfer immediately to you, and they have cases in progress, right?
Like they have inventory. They have inventory.
Right. And so, they know also, because it's more commonplace in those fields, they can associate counsel, they can refer them out, and they can earn out that way. And so that's where those type of practices are usually going to require you to come with more cash at closing, whether you put it down or with getting a bank funded, deal, right? And, the other part of your question was what funding is available. A lot of it, of course, what we talked about could be seller provided, right? Either seller financed, they would do the deal, do a performance-based and earn-out type structure. But SBA financing is probably mostly our go-to because of reasonable rates. We've got good SBA lenders that like the law firm vertical. But now what we're seeing is equity lenders come into the space. So that's, not banks, but just, private equity, private money that have formed in groups that are financing these type of, bigger, structures and everything else. And we're also seeing some banks that are just focused on lawyers starting to create their own platform, not SBA driven, but they're just going to have, they're going to be a bank that's going to help fund buying and selling of law firms and anything else that lawyers or law firms need. But that's really, they're going to use it to, help fuel growth, help maintain and bring in new relationships. So the funding's definitely out there.
And I've heard you talk, you were on a podcast, Financially Legal, with a friend of mine, Dan Lear. And then you did a series on the Lawyerist podcast, which was a great series that I encourage people to check out as well, because you go on some different angles that we've talked about here. And you did a specific podcast on valuation, but I didn't want to talk buying and selling without at least touching on valuation. And it's got to be tricky, or is it not? I mean, you talk about sort of that lawyer specific firm where they know him or her as they walk down the street, and, valuing a practice like that, I imagine it's kind of on the intangibles like goodwill and personal brand and all that. I mean, how challenging is it to get the buyer and the seller together on valuation and practices like that?
The challenge of bringing two attorneys of sometimes multiple different generations together, it's easy.
Right. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Easiest part of your job.
That's right. Absolutely. And again, the conversations vary and are all over the place. I think depending on the practice, but if we go back to our first example of that, Rotarian attorney, everything else, valuation is made up of, I focus on what we look at when we perform a valuation analysis is what is transferable value, meaning what can you transfer to another, right? Right? You're going to take it from you and you're going to pass this baton to another, and you are going to use a transition plan to do so. So I tell everybody, it's not throw the keys, here you go, see you later. It is you're sticking around, to the outside world. It's probably seen as, you've added Josh as a partner, right? I mean, you've softened, the outside, and you're going to stay around to really just transition, be a goodwill ambassador, everything else. But I tell everybody our definition for, transferable value is really that firm value plus the personal value included with what transition plan you're going to offer. If, because of health, because of timeline, you've gotten to the point you're like, hey, I want to retire in 6 months, but be done. We don't have much transition plan, and that's going to ding your overall value, right? But if I can, have parties invested in the transition-based, handoff and really focus on that, we're a believer that what the previous attorney has done, you should be able to do. There may be some discounts, some attrition loss, other things planned, but if they've been doing $1 million in revenue, the hope is you can be doing something close to that if they're willing to help transition, right? And kind of go through that and everything else. The toughest part sometimes is, the value, but it's really comes down to the payment terms, which we were just talking about. How do you get to that value, right? And I think that's the biggest thing of why we talk about openly. It's okay to have a performance-based metric as part of the payment terms, because to that attorney that, goes to Rotary and everything else, I mean, if they do a deal and they get, hit by a bus the day after, they've signed that deal, that's a huge loss to that transition plan. It's a huge ding to that personal value, right? And they may need mentorship, the buyer and everything else. And so there'd be a loss. And so that's where we hedge our loss risk with the buyer to basically say, this is, to your point, it's a succession plan, right? That we've kind of created under this one. To the PI practice that has 1,000 cases in inventory and all these assets and firm-driven marketing, if that owner goes out and something happens to him, the day after, there's probably not a lot of loss, right? Because the business will continue and the intake and the clients and everything else as part of that. So overall, valuations is always a challenge, but it's really, crafting those structures of payment of how to get to that, right? How to get to a shared risk model dependent on what the practice is.
Yeah. And I go back to how you answered this, getting two lawyers to agree to all this, I'm sure that's where you earn your money there and are probably underpaid, although I have no idea how you get paid. I was going to ask that, but that's some emotionally draining and laborious work, I'm sure. You must be really good at your job to be able to pull that off consistently. I guess what I was going to say, my remark on that is, as a searcher then, keeping that in mind, because that transition plan is, like you said, this is not a turnkey transaction, whereas buying, and again, not equating lawyers to donuts, but, going into a donut shop, right? Where the operations are less personalized. There are operations that exist. There's no real secret sauce per se. A new owner can, take over that donut shop in less than 30 days and not skip a beat, because the nature of our profession, that transition plan sounds like it takes more of a primary role, almost probably the primary role in these deals, over valuation and price terms in many ways. How long are these generally? I'm sure they range, but if there is a range for a typical sort of, are we talking 3 months? Are we talking 12 months to 18 months? What is kind of not standard, but you know what I'm saying? What do you guys generally try to structure for a transition plan?
Yeah, again, dependent on, goals, needs, everything else, but 6 to 18 months. Okay. And that's our overall, we actually don't want to extend it too long, right? So the more we can accelerate it to the front end of that, timeline, the better. And our seller may still stay associated. So even though they're not actively, working in the practice, or they're not, kind of doing that, they still may be there as an of counsel, right? So their name's still attached. But our goal is to provide that exit strategy. So transition plan of 6 months, let's just call it 12 months, right? On average, the first 3 months, they're really, they're working hard. Our sellers 3 months after closing are working hard because they're introducing, they're, transitioning, over management, over other aspects, right? And they're still kind of working on, the client work that maybe they were doing or other things to kind of hand those, matters or cases or anything else over. After that, right, the client work should transition pretty fast if that's their goal. The management should be mostly transition. And we just want them focused on that goodwill ambassador introduction, role for really that next 9, 12, whatever months. Is they need to be there to say, hey, my top 5 referral sources, 5, are these. We need to go have lunch, right? Or I usually speak every year at this association's annual conference. We need to make sure we do it, but instead of me doing it, we'll both do it this year, right? Like we'll be co-speakers. And to build out, that plan, and that's a big part of what we do during due diligence. So if we can get through the easy part we just talked about, if we can get to that during due diligence, before we get to the table that we're closed, we're done, our goal is to get both parties to focus on this. The seller knows their business, right? They know, who these referral sources are, what it really takes, and the buyer knows where they want to take things, hopefully. And so we try to merge those together to say, okay, buyer, what do you need? And seller, what do you think the buyer needs to make this a success? And let's go ahead and start calendaring those, right? So the first week, the seller knows exactly what their role is and what they're supposed to be doing. We've already got things on the calendar for introductions to those referral sources. We've already planned on submitting our co-speaker to that association, and we're really moving forward in kind of that cadence. So the biggest thing too is just kind of a stop is that's to transition your ownership and the value, right? We have sellers that it probably doesn't surprise you. We have attorneys that they know they need a succession or a continuation plan, and they're done managing. They're done with the ownership risk, but they want to keep practicing law.
Makes sense.
And, my guess is, Josh, to somebody like yourself, if you were looking at a firm and the seller wanted to stay on, practicing law, but just, it was right. Like, okay, like we can work, that deal. And usually you're getting expert attorney advice at pretty good discount because, they want to be maybe not a lifelong attorney, but they want to do it under a flexible where they're not having to manage payroll and do all of this, but they want to just continue to do that. And so that is different. That timeline is totally different than what I talk about for transitioning the value, right? Those different.
I like that. That makes sense. I don't know too many lawyers, who are, at the tail end of their career that do a hard stop on practice, right? It's so tough for lawyers to step out of the practice. It's defined. It has a tendency to define who we are and our identity. You know what I mean? And so it's tough to just press stop on that one day and go kick it on the beach. Right? I don't see that happen. I can't imagine you see that happen too often either.
No, and absolutely. And when I started doing this 10 years ago, I'm an attorney CPA. So I was transactional and numbers and, let's move this through. And a good friend of mine, Camille Stell, who now works with us closely and everything else, really would stop and say, hey, some of these attorneys, it's a real emotional challenge for them to think about retirement, right? And it's a real emotional challenge for them to think about not being an attorney. And so that's where the transition plan piece becomes very important because it is a comfort. Like, what do you want that to look like? If I'm an attorney running at 100 miles an hour and I'm 70 years old, the outside world may say, you don't need it financially. Why would you still keep practicing? But to them, they do. They want to keep practicing, right? It's their identity. It's what they are, proud of. And so knowing that as part of any structure or any transaction is a big thing. I get stopped by that more times than I do typically the financials. It's the emotional challenge of what will I be doing if I'm not an attorney, right? And that's why I kind of say, look, if you want to be an attorney all the way until, your time on this earth is over, you can do that. But overall, creating your succession plan, creating your disaster plan, right, for your firm, for your people, for your clients, we can do all that now. And then you can just keep practicing, as you want to for as long as you're able to, going forward, because attorneys don't do well to go from 100 to 0. Right?
No.
Like emotionally, we would not do well, any of us, to run that fast and then all of a sudden say, I don't have anything to do today, right? Like, what do I do, right? So the slowdown over time works very well.
And not to stay too long on a transition plan, but it seems so interesting. It is interesting to me. Like, do you get like into a battle of forms with that? Like, does seller have a version and you have and the buyer has a version and you gotta, or do you come like and present a model one? Like, I'm just so curious how you prompt that, because the seller probably doesn't have one. That's probably part of the problem. They've never thought about it. So how are they going to think about it? And as a buyer, they don't know the business yet. So I'm sure they have some very, you know, typical things to be worried about, but because they're not in that practice yet, they don't know what they don't know. So I'm curious, like, how do you prompt that transition planning?
Yeah, absolutely. We used to get almost the standoff, is what you're kind of explaining of, you know, and we've had a deal before where we've had like a seller and buyer, who didn't pay attention to the transition plan, and then they get to closing, and essentially we're checking in, and buyers saying, well, there's just not a lot going on. I haven't been introduced to anybody, anything else. And then we talk to the seller and they say, I don't own the firm anymore. I'm just waiting for them to tell me what they want me to do. Right. And so that was a scenario that it was, back then, fortunately, it was local, and it was almost like taking their two hands, sitting at the table and saying, okay, seller, let's go through, who are your top referral sources? Right. And they start, oh, well, so-and-so and so-and-so. And we'd have buyers sitting over there like this, and we're like, hey, buyer, you need to write that down, right? Like, you need to write that down. And then the next question is, okay, seller, how do we need to introduce, right? And kind of go through that. So that's like a baseline. We try to do a lot more upfront, today. But really, we usually start with seller to say, what do you think an ideal transition is going to look like? Or what do you think somebody's going to need to know? Like, that's part of our question as we onboard any of our sellers, right? Like, what do you think it's going to take? What do you think the timeline is that you want to introduce, to transition, everything else? And then we ask buyers, like, you can go through our intake on our website. We ask, buyers, like, what do you think you need? Do you think you need mentorship? Do you think you need, management help, right? Like, what are those different things based on, again, Josh, like kind of how we started this, like, what's your background? What's your goals? You may not need as much on management or how to be an entrepreneur owner, right? But it may be something that, if you were going to start practicing, law there, you're going to say, I need some legal mentorship, right? To kind of build that out, or anything else. So it is a little bit of whose version's first. Typically what we do now is seller version, right, is first. And then we really try to get buyer input, from that, to ask questions, to develop that. And the best thing that we've come up with, and it's the simplest thing you can do, is a weekly lunch, right? And
Makes sense.
And I mean, I tell everybody, it's like, you have to have, cadence is everything, right? So if you have a weekly lunch where you even if it's a virtual lunch, right? It doesn't have to be an in-person or anything else, but it's really to go through. And even if it starts with sellers saying, I ran into this client, and I was thinking this would be something good to share with you, because it happens, every so often. That's the mentorship, right? Or it's the seller saying, hey, I got a call from, Joe down at Rotary, and he was saying they need a speaker for next month. Are you up, for doing that, right? Or it's something that's more complex with more sophisticated practices, which is, hey, we were just, had a marketing call, with our outsourced company last month. This was all the data metrics. Let me explain to you, right, how we've typically, read and analyzed these, and how you may want to, read and evaluate whether you want to keep them, going forward, whether you see some different path or anything else. But that weekly review just softens everything and keeps communications going. Like, our biggest thing is from a brokerage standpoint or advisor, is we try to be in between, because everybody, they got to work with each other, right? But at some point we want to say, all right, now you guys go and you talk, right? And we want that communication channel open between the parties. And then we need that communication and cadence to kind of continue forward.
Yeah, it's like on the front end of deals, time kills deals, and on the back end of deals, it's like silence kills the deal, right? You
Correct.
gotta have that, and I could see people overlooking that, especially initially because they don't really know how to spend their time together, and they're still getting to know each other. So, um, yeah, I was going to ask you. It's a good time to ask. So, what are you, Tom? Are you an advisor? Are you a broker? Are you a lawyer? Are you a CPA? Heck, it sounds like you do some therapy. I guess you could give me the the best answer in my book. You're an entrepreneur, but we'll take that one out of it. So, how do you describe what you are to other people? Because you wear a lot of hats.
Absolutely. It's a little bit of an identity crisis for me, Josh, because, by degree, right, I kind of hold back to just like those attorneys I was saying about, like my identity, right? I'm an attorney. But, at this point, even though I have ownership still in a firm, right? I mean, Law Practice Exchange is where I live. So
Mm-hmm.
by that aspect, I'm a founder, right? I'm an accredited business intermediary. But really what I would tell people is as much as, I would call myself a broker and a consultant, right? And from that aspect, it does kind of, one day we're here or that, since this marketplace and since the tenure of it is still fairly short, right, as to we are a leading proponent, as you mentioned, of building this marketplace, right, saturating it, because I believe it's good for the profession, right, to have the option to hand off, to build, and then hand off to somebody else what you've built versus build and wind down, right, or from somebody new starting from zero, they can start from up here with true mentorship. And so, that's the belief. And if I'm there, yes, I'm a broker, right? But a lot of times we get the questions of like, well, who are you retained by? I would say that's where the consulting is. We're there to make, construct a deal, right? To make that work for both sides. We don't do any deals where it's one side wins all and the other side loses. Like we don't, because so much is transition based. If those parties have to work with each other afterwards, you're just asking for problems and everything else. Plus we're dealing with attorneys, right? So it's full disclosure, full openness, right? Full dialogue. We're trying to really have that open communication. So overall, where my role is now is that broker consultant role.
So I've got to ask you, and you don't have to give specific numbers, but I'm curious, how do you structure how do you get paid basically? Is it a percentage of deal value? Is it then consulting? Because I mean, I've had some interactions with, I'll say typical business brokers. And you go along, it sounds like you're attached to the deal longer than most because of that transition plan. And it sounds like, I'm not trying to kiss up to you in any way, but it sounds like that's money well spent, quite honestly, right? Because that transition plan has to be crafted, and you're not serving as an intermediary per se, because I'm not suggesting buyer and seller post deal are adversarial, but you're there to make sure the deal is progressing, or maybe not. Maybe you are done after closing. I'm probably making some gross assumptions here. Help me understand just how your fees are and how long you're involved in the deal, if you're open to sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we, under that brokerage model, right, we operate on a success fee, a contingency fee, right, for all our, plaintiff lawyers or other contingent lawyers out there. So, typically that's 10% and it kind of scales down from there. And that's so, we have some other fixed fees for valuation, other aspects to it, but really that's our motivation. That's how we get paid, is bringing a deal together. Achieving that you as the seller, you as the buyer have approved that deal, it closes, and there is value to be exchanged. And then we, take a percentage of that, just like
Mm-hmm.
our plaintiffs' attorneys who get a good court case, good award, they take a percentage for their months or years of effort. And we kind of are on the same. Like it takes us months or years to get a deal done, and we'll be compensated at the end for that. And then to your point is, because so much of really our historical deals and still deals today are paid over time, we took the position, contrary to a lot of other brokers and contrary to some advice that broker mentors in the market gave to me, is instead of just taking all of our fee, 10% of the total value at closing, we earn with our clients. And so the biggest part of that, Josh, is to your point or to your question is we want to make sure it's going to be a successful deal, right? Because if it's paid over time and the deal fails and we didn't do transition plan, right, and everything else. So we're not there. Like I said, we try to step back as we near closing to really get the parties to move forward. But we are there as check-ins because we're financially vested.
So with some time remaining, I want to get to our second hypothetical. And you might be like ready to say, Josh, you're like, I see where you're going, buddy, but I just don't see it happening. And of course, this is the recent law graduate. So let's just play this out. So I sent you, so I'm a third year law student and I'm graduating this spring, right? I have debt, but it's not crippling debt, but it's still debt. And I want to build my own firm solo or build my own small law firm. Is what we're talking about today a realistic possibility at all for a new law grad to look at acquiring? And I know we've talked about some of this already. Acquiring, yes, we tend to think of a high velocity transaction because we're so used to sort of thinking like in M&A terms and in the small business market, but thinking about the transition plan and all that and talking about how this is kind of engineering succession. So knowing we say in acquiring, yes, we're not saying like the law student's going to come to the table with $500,000 and buy a law firm, but is pursuing the ultimate acquisition of a law firm a viable option for a new law grad? Have you seen it at all? And if not, do you think it's actually viable?
And I'll give my standard attorney response. Yes, but it depends, right?
Okay.
And so, what I would say to that, Josh, is typically, again, if you're looking at a brand new, lawyer, right, who's come out of law school, financially, they're just probably getting started and they've got, potentially some law school debt and, other things. They got to buy a house. They maybe need to get married still. Like there's all these different life things. So it's one of kind of where we started again is, like, what's your why and what's your goals, from this? And if, those don't align with kind of these other obligations over here, then maybe you're better to go be employed somewhere for a while, right? And to kind of tuck that in your pocket for now, but have that as being an eventual plan or purpose. Where we've been successful is very entrepreneurial and mature, new law grads, or even second career law grads, right? Ones that have come back to law school or anything else. They've been married, their kids are older, right? Anything else from that side. That said is the reason there's financial challenges, right? To getting out and kind of running something. There's knowing how to practice law, right? Like you're starting from zero on that practical aspect. But all that said is there are opportunities. Like if you're a brand new, young attorney and your goal is to do it, there are opportunities because we have lots of lawyers that don't have a continuation plan, right? They don't have anybody in their firm. A lot of them are in smaller markets geographically. They have very viable, good practices. They haven't been able to attract employee associates, right? To that market for any prolonged period of time or anything else. But what now they're offering is it's not just a job, it's an opportunity to have this ownership, right? And what I look at is, because I get to see all this, is, we got employees that are like, or, attorneys that come out and want to stay in the major metros. And I get it, right? They're going to stay there or anything else. But if they went an hour outside of it, they'd make way more money, right? With a lifestyle that the practice closes at noon on Friday, right? And it's just kind of interesting. And then there's this, the entrepreneur where you can take that and you can say, start here. And if you can build, it really helps like a hub and spoke, business model, right? Like where you start is where you build your foundation and how you want to grow from there. So maybe in a couple of years, you'll have an office back in that metro, but you've set your foundation somewhere else. The legal deserts, right, as they've started to be talked about, of where there's this void of attorneys. I do think if you're a new law school grad and you're open to geographic, right? One, you can serve a tremendous need. There's less competition in these markets. I mean, Josh, just as an aside, we get these weird things that like small markets, we'll get like 2 or 3 sellers at a time contacting us, and we're thinking to ourselves like it's just because they're all aging out at the same time. Well, I guess we've done a good job through our network or otherwise of like spreading the word, but now we've got this and we kind of know if we can get one firm or something to come in and take over, like they'll own the market, right? Like there's a few $1,000,000 in revenue sitting there, and we just need somebody to come in, but they need to be able to see it's not in major metros, it's going to be outside of it. And I think that's where the opportunities for the new law grad would be. You're going to find those in the major metros, but it's going to also be what I'd say is probably a 2-step purchase versus, or maybe a 3 or whatever, how you want to call it, versus a go in and buy everything. So you may come in and take a role, and that role is an associate attorney, but the plan should be discussed and really detailed prior to taking that role. Like you should have an idea of what you're going to be asked to pay, when you're going to pay it, like all that should be structured as part of you kind of joining the firm, right? If it's a solo attorney and they don't have a plan and you want to go work but be the eventual owner, don't wait to detail that. Go ahead and detail it like as part of you coming to work for them, right? And then it becomes that apprenticeship model. You work for a year or so, but you are both pulling in the same direction, meaning the seller knows you're going to take over. You've already agreed on terms. They're introducing you to people, they're training you, they're telling you how to manage the staff and the team, and you're working towards that, but you have somebody to help you along the way. So that's maybe a long explanation, but I think right now there's definitely
one.
What's that?
I said it's a thoughtful one. I mean, it really is a thoughtful one. I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, there's an easy cynic take on this, which I'm hearing all those voices, and I'm sure you hear them too in your heads of our peers in the bar. But there's an optimistic and realism to this as well, because the apprenticeship model, it's funny you bring that up, is on life support. I won't say dead, it still happens. But this is a way of modernizing that to some degree. And getting out in front of that. And I'm thinking of some of my students and recent grads. There's a mindset shift of I'm going to find a job versus I'm being deliberate about finding a firm I ultimately want to own or I want to be an owner of, right? We get caught in this trap of I've got to be asked by current partners to become a partner. And that's a big mystery. I don't know if that's ever. Listening to you talk, it's that new lawyer taking command and ownership over their career and being deliberate and not allowing it to rest in the hands of someone else. And while that's not for every grad, that market's still growing. I love that because it empowers so many new lawyers who struggle. And as we talked about earlier, our identity, this profession, for a lot of reasons, identifies itself through being a lawyer, right? And when you don't have a job or you're trying to find a job and you don't have one, or you feel like you've got to just take what comes along, that's immediately, you're off on the wrong foot in this profession. We already have imposter syndrome. You add this, you're starting to doubt yourself. Why did I go to law school? I've got to take this. So that mindset shift that you're presenting here, I think is a huge catalyst. It's not an easy one, but empowering a new law grad to think about it this way. It's completely entrepreneurial thinking. It's like, listen, don't think about it as going to get your first law job. Think about it as taking your first step to building the lifestyle and the profession you want. That to me just feel, I'm on my soapbox, Tom, but that just gets me going.
No, and I'll give you a couple quick stories or anything else to kind of support it. the first time we did a program on selling a law firm, I was really curious if we'd have any, attorneys actually show up in person. We had 50 attorneys, mostly, small law firm owners. And we had a session, all right, like a session on, again, the associate, how to find the associate takeover. And I mean, it got vocal. It got mean. Like, I've tried to hire, an associate before, and they just stay for a year or two and leave. The takeaway that we did, and I think everybody bought into this somewhat, is don't hire an associate. If you're looking for a succession plan, you're not hiring an associate, you're hiring your buyer, right? That's a different interview process. That's different interview questions. That's different candidates. So don't hire an associate and expect them to be your buyer, right? Somewhere down the road. And you probably never told them that, right? Like, you never shared with them that, hey, I'm hiring you because I hope you're going to take over the firm in 3 to 5 years. Share that, right? Be open with that and change the dialogue and change the questions to hire your buyer, not hire an associate. The other is, we've run into situations before where, again, the law firm world, and you know this because you're in different circles as well, it's very small pond, right? And so we get contacted sometimes by the owner of the firm, right? Who's there and it's like, well, I have, a great associate, but they're not going to be an ideal buyer. They're not interested, and, everything else. In the meantime, we've been contacted by that associate who has said, look, there's no opportunity here for me to take over ownership. I've really thought I've expressed this and, kind of shown my interest, but I'm interested. I'm a seasoned attorney. I want to buy something else, right? And it's like, they're not talking to each other. And so to your point, it's like, for the associate, and I do encourage that. And again, to your students or anything else, it's okay to basically say, I would be interested in being, the successor or being an owner or being a partner to this firm. What does that look like? And I think most would accept that as, most current owners that would be retirees or sellers should see that as a huge opportunity, right? That you're bringing that up in dialogue. They're not going to have the answers, just to let you know. But it changes the dialogue and changes the opportunity. And then, if you can lock it in on that, it just changes the trajectory, right? Now you're not coming in as this lowly associate. You're coming as the future owner. You're the chosen one, right? And, as part of that, you can work a lot more hand in hand than, I'm not sure I want to introduce them to my Rotary Club, because if I introduce them to everybody and they leave me, then they're going to take my referral sources, right? That's not a good place to be in. So yeah, change the conversation and empowering that younger generation to be the voice that brings it. And then, there's resources out there like us or others that can help craft it if you get that conversation moving.
It goes back to how you frame things. If you change the frame, you change the conversation, right? And just like you said, I mean, you're in the long game educating, and I'm in education too, coming at it from the student side and helping them reframe their future and reframe this profession. And it does change the conversation. So I just love that. You've been gracious with your time. Let me just cover off on a couple other things. For anyone who's listening, like, what's the best way to get a hold of you, Tom? How do you want listeners who have questions to follow up? Like, where do they go to learn more about you and connect with you? What are the best channels?
I mean, our website, probably for resources, podcasts like this, other ones that we put up there, FAQs. It's also a great place to go through. And if you just want to have a confidential conversation, right? We have kind of that automatic kind of scheduling, form that you can go through. But that's thelawpracticeexchange.com. So it's thelawpracticeexchange.com. We're also on the socials, most, not all. We haven't jumped into TikTok or others, just yet, but I'm sure there's a place for that. But, find on LinkedIn, you can go and look me up again, Tom Lenfestey. Good luck on spelling the name, but, once you get it, you know it type of thing. But definitely thelawpracticeexchange.com. You can look at our listings. You can look at those resources. And again, we really believe that in order to build this as an option, it's about education. And the more we can kind of promote that, the more the market will move in the future successfully. So we're happy to kind of help out, even if it's just quick questions otherwise.
And I'll drop all those links in the show notes as well. So it's easy to people to just click through. And then finally, putting you on the spot a little bit here. Obviously, the podcast is called The Legal Modernist. And this is all really around getting people in the profession to build and make and create new things, new business models, new services, and new products, and really having those conversations with people like you. So I'll ask you, Tom, can I call you a legal modernist?
I would say I don't know that's how I started out, but as as we've built and everything else, and realizing the changes that need to have happened or have happened or anything else, we're excited to provide this new opportunity, right? And we think it's something that once every lawyer considers it as an option, like, hey, I could buy a law firm, or maybe I want to sell my law firm. That has changed the profession, going forward for decades, and the business model of law for a certain aspect going forward. So yeah, I'll humbly accept that title, and hopefully I carry the torch well.
Well, I think you're one heck of a modernist, to be honest, Tom. I think you're doing some remarkable things. So I appreciate it, and thanks to all the listeners.